Winslow Homer, it's safe to say, is the best-known American painter of the 19th century. His images of children at play, boats being sailed, men and women in fields and pastures are so familiar and seem so well understood that we have to remind ourselves that in Homer's time, and for his audience, their meanings were richer and more complex.
Throughout his life, Homer was unwilling to say very much about his art or about what his pictures may have meant. That's where looking closely at the paintings themselves and trying to see the changes, the additions, the deletions that Homer made can help us to understand better their meaning and content.
Homer began his career at the time of the Civil War, which he covered as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly. The war also inspired his first paintings. One of the most moving of them is The Veteran in a New Field, painted in 1865.
It shows a Union veteran returned from the front and re-engaged in peaceful pursuits. His military jacket and canteen have been laid aside. At the end of the Civil War, many feared that veterans would not peacefully re-enter civilian life, but they did. The poet Walt Whitman said the successful disbandment of the Union armies was a proof of democracy. That's one of the meanings Homer's painting conveys. The soldier is harvesting a wonderfully tall field of grain. The abundant harvest of 1865 was understood as a symbol of divine blessing on the successful outcome of the war, from the Union point of view.
Because oil paint can become more transparent over time, now we can observe other things as well. The scythe held by the veteran once had a cradle. A cradle was a framework of wooden rods mounted above the blade that helped gather the grain and enable the scythe to cut more efficiently. It was commonly used at the time. By painting out the cradle and emphasizing instead a single-bladed scythe, Homer made the image less realistic as a contemporary agricultural scene, but more symbolic, for the scythe now alludes to the traditional personification of death as the Grim Reaper.
This image was frequently used during the Civil War. One of the most compelling photographs of the battlefield at Gettysburg was entitled The Harvest of Death. Battles were described by saying the enemy has been cut down like grain before the reaper. When viewed in the context of popular imagery and rhetoric of the time, this apparently simple picture of a reaper takes on a more complex meaning, and Homer's modification of the scythe becomes more significant. In one image, past and present are condensed. The painting evokes both the tragedy of the Civil War and America's future as a land of peace and prosperity.
In the summer of 1873, Homer spent several months in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where he painted many watercolors of children. In 1876, he exhibited the oil painting Breezing Up, on which he had worked for 3 years, making numerous changes.
Homer's practice of revising his paintings, of rethinking and changing them, can be seen by a technical process known as infrared reflectography that reveals the underlayers of paint. For instance, in the background, there were once additional boats, similar to ones we see in a wood engraving that Homer did of Gloucester Harbor. After having painted the boats in Breezing Up, Homer removed them, changing the scene from a crowded harbor to open sea, retaining only the vessel at the far right.
Other changes can be observed as well. An oil sketch for this painting shows a fourth boy seated in the bow of the boat and the tiller in the hand of the man, the only adult aboard. Homer originally painted Breezing Up the same way, but in the end, Homer made the boy at the stern steer the boat, transferring control of the vessel from old age to youth. The fourth boy, originally at the bow, was also painted out and replaced by an anchor.
The addition of the anchor may have been an aesthetic decision, that improved the composition of the painting. But it's interesting to note that the anchor is a traditional symbol of hope. In 1876, when Homer completed Breezing Up, America was celebrating its centennial, honored in Philadelphia by a great exposition. The nation was said to be animated by a new hopefulness and described as only in its childhood. The youthful energy and optimism that fill Homer's painting and the hope symbolized in it are in keeping with the mood of the centennial moment. Despite its apparent simplicity, Breezing Up is the result of many alterations that were clearly intended to enrich its meaning beyond a mere record of daily life.
Homer once said about one of his works, "Don't let the public poke its nose into my picture." But if we today hope to understand his art fully, we do need to poke our noses into his pictures and try to recapture some of the meanings that would have been far more evident to his own contemporaries. It was, after all, their time his work depicted, not ours.
More particularly, Homer refused to talk publicly about his art, to say why he painted in the way that he did and what his paintings meant. But by peering beneath their surfaces, to examine the changes he made while painting them, as we've done, and then asking why he took the trouble, often the very considerable trouble, of making those changes, we can begin to understand something of Homer's methods and purposes that otherwise we might not know.